Any single event can produce a whole host of conflicting realities. What actually happened isn't always what's remembered or what gets reported. It really just depends on who's holding the microphone.
So in this analysis, we're going to deconstruct one single court hearing and the three completely different realities that came out of it. We're going to look at the official record, what our on-site asset actually saw, and then the story that was ultimately sold to the public.
Here's how we'll break this down. First, we'll dig into the official court record. Then, we'll get some context from our observer on the inside. After that, we'll analyze the public narrative that was built around the event. And finally, we'll synthesize it all.
All right, let's start with the official record. Think of this as reality stripped of all the emotion, all the spin. These are just the cold, hard facts as documented by the court. This is our baseline. Okay, first things first, and this is absolutely critical to understand. This was a bond hearing. That's it. Its purpose was purely administrative. It was not a trial about guilt or innocence. The only goal here was to assess risk and set the conditions for a potential release.
Now, what the court focused on here is really telling. The judge wasn't interested in the subject's right to protest or any ideology behind it. No, as you can see, the court was focused exclusively on behavior, a pattern of violating orders, of creating confrontations, and a very clear cycle of escalation.
And this quote from the judge, well, it really highlights a key point from the official record. The judge was explicit about the monetization of the conflict, and you can see a real skepticism about using these confrontations to generate income and, audience engagement. That motivation was definitely a factor in the court's assessment.
So the subject was released, but let's be very clear about what that means. It was a procedural release that came with strict conditions. We're talking supervised release and a no-contact order. Now that is fundamentally different from a vindication, which would imply the court somehow sided with the subject's actions.
And to wrap up this section, the record is crystal clear. The judge actually went out of her way to affirm the subject's constitutional right to protest. So for the court, the issue was never the protest itself. It was the specific actions that violated legally binding orders. That nuance is everything.
Okay, now let's add another layer. We had an observer inside that courtroom, and their perspective gives us a feel for the atmosphere, something you're just not going to get from a dry transcript. So, what was our observer's main takeaway? It was all business. The entire focus in that room was on managing risk and following procedure, not some grand battle of ideas.
Our asset noted that the opposing lawyers were there, but they were pretty much just passive observers. The judge? She wasn't so much hostile as she was just unimpressed. And the focus, again and again, kept coming back to the subject's behavior and the violation of court orders. The energy in the room was procedural. It wasn't theatrical. And this slide right here shows the fundamental disconnect. The court clearly saw the subject as an active agent, someone creating the conditions that led to the bond violations. But the public narrative that's implied, it often frames the subject as a passive victim, just stumbling into circumstances that others have orchestrated.
Our observer's summary says it all, really. That courtroom was not the scene of some big ideological battle over free speech. It was the scene of a legal proceeding, one that was concerned with a single individual's repeated failure to stick to court-mandated boundaries.
All right, now for the third reality. This is how that same pretty dry procedural event was presented to the public. And, well, this is where the story really begins to shift.
So, how does this happen? How does a routine, frankly kind of boring legal hearing about bond conditions get turned into a dramatic chapter in this ongoing saga of persecution and resistance? Well, it's not by accident. It is a very deliberate process of narrative construction.
You can actually break down the strategy here. First, you hammer home the idea of persecution. Second, you frame the court not as a neutral party, but as a biased one. Third, you conveniently leave out all that dull procedural context, like the fact that it's just a bond hearing. Fourth, you shift the focus away from documented actions and onto supposed intentions. And finally, you position the subject as the central martyr in a much larger fight.
Now, to analyze this, we don't have to guess anyone's motives. We just have to ask three simple questions. Number one, what information is being left out? Like the judge's support for protest rights. Two, what emotions are being cranked up to 11? Think outrage, martyrdom. And finally, who or what benefits from framing the story in this exact way?
Okay, let's put this all together. When you compare the official record, the observed reality, and the public narrative side by side, some really interesting patterns start to emerge.
This table makes it pretty clear.
Each of these realities is trading in a different kind of currency. The court deals in the world of behavior and documented actions. The public stream, on the other hand, deals in narrative and emotional engagement. Our job, as analysts, is to spot the patterns and the discrepancies between the two. We see something you could call a narrative spotlight effect. In this reframing, other people, like the alleged victims of the subject's actions, they just vanish from the story. Complex institutions like the court system get flattened out into simple props. They're either for our guy or against him. And that spotlight stays locked on one protagonist. When you boil it all down, the court's entire process was just an attempt to answer one very simple, very practical question. Based on past behavior, can this individual be trusted to follow clear, court-ordered boundaries? But the public narrative? It was never designed to answer the court's question. Not at all. It was built to answer a completely different one. How do we keep the audience engaged through this event? And those two questions, well, they lead to two very, very different realities. And that, right there, is the final takeaway. Whenever you're consuming information about any public conflict, you have to ask yourself, which question is this story built to answer? The one about facts and behaviors, or the one about keeping me hooked?